want to talk a little bit about terminal ballistics with knives. And of course, ballistics is a misnomer. We're just talking about the wounding mechanism, but it's something you need to understand if you're going to use a knife to defend yourself. A lot of guys with the firearms, they study the ballistics, but they don't have any particular interest in the anatomy, which is interesting because it's important to what you do. But I actually, on a firearms forum, brought up studying anatomy as being important and got an amazing amount of resistance. So, on the other hand, a lot of the knife guys, they study anatomy, but they don't take into account the terminal effects of their blade. So you have to have an understanding of the two, and it helps in what you're doing. Now, the wounding mechanism is different. The bullets, you'll get displacement of the tissue due to hydraulic effects. So you will get damage to tissue beyond the actual path of the bullet as velocities increase. That's not true with knives. With knives, you actually have to have mechanical contact between the knife and the tissue that you're dealing with to get damage. Now, generally for firearms, they're looking for a minimum of 14 inches of penetration. It's a minimum. I don't know why this turned all of a sudden into the ideal. Anything over 14 is just gravy. And as far as over-penetration goes, that's a whole other discussion, but we'll get into that. Now, to get 14 inches of penetration with a knife, you'd have to have a 14-inch blade, which is why swords were so popular. However, a sword is a little difficult to carry most of the time, so we're going to have to deal with less. So you're not going to get that 14 inches of penetration. Now, because you're able to apply it differently than you do the damage on a firearm, you don't really need a 14-inch blade, but you do have to be aware of your blade length. Okay, how do we shut down our opponent? We generally want our opponent to stop doing what he's doing, robbing us, assaulting us, whatever. And there are a number of ways that this occurs. First is psychology. Now, psychology is probably the best. I've won more bar fights with psychology than with fists. However, that's up to your opponent. And psychology applies simply, you're walking along confidently, you're aware of your surroundings, you look like you're in reasonably good shape, you move well. Somebody you're not even aware of may take a look at you and decide, you know what, I'm not going to rob him, I'm going to look for somebody that's an easier target. You just have command presence. The guy comes up to rob you and says, back off, okay, whoa, maybe he decides to go off to somebody else. You pull a gun, you pull a knife. Guy decides, hey, this isn't worth it. You make a shallow cut, he reaches for you, you give him a little cut on the hand, and he sees the blood and decides maybe he needs to go to the emergency room. Okay, that's all psychological, and this is great. I mean, boom, he goes off, you're on your own, we're good. You don't even have to do a police report if you don't want to. But that's up to your opponent. If your opponent decides he's not going to quit because of any of that, okay, so now we get into the actual mechanical stopping, the actual physically stopping your opponent. First is your central nervous system. If you can shut down the central nervous system, you've shut down your opponent. With a firearm, brain or spine shot. With a knife, yes, you can penetrate the brain, powerful thrust down through the temple, into the eye socket, through the ear even. But those can be difficult, and you have to have a blade capable of it. You have to have technique. You have to be in a position to do it. You can sever the spinal cord. Anything above the shoulders will generally stop the activity. Below the shoulders, again, if he's armed with a gun, it's not going to do anything for his trigger finger. And again, that's difficult. You've got the spine can be very difficult to penetrate. It can cut. You have to go between the bones. I mean, this is tricky. It's possible, but it's not something you can count on. Exsanguination, bleed out. As the brain loses blood, your opponent will pass out. You cut a large enough artery, femoral artery, brachial artery, abdominal artery. After a little while, your opponent will bleed out, and they will stop doing what they're doing. In the meantime, you have to deal with them because they may continue doing what it was you don't want them to do. The heart. If you can penetrate the heart, that's great. You get what's called the dead man's anywhere from 6 to 8 seconds, where somebody can be fully functional even when their heart is stopped until the brain depressurizes. The blood depressurizes, the brain shuts down. Now, you can also send somebody into shock. And again, this is something you can't count on, but it's possible. With a stab, the pain, blood loss, the body will go into shock. It withdraws the blood from the limbs, from the head, and your opponent will black right out. But that's not something you can always count on. Cut off their air. Once the blood can no longer be oxygenated, the brain will shut down, but that takes even longer than bleeding out. And then there's mechanical damage, which is probably of more interest to us. If you can prevent a hand from functioning, it'll drop the gun, drop the knife. If you can cut an Achilles tendon, do sufficient, cut muscle in the arm or in the leg, you can prevent your opponent from standing, from chasing you, from using his weapon. So this is more what we're looking for with a knife, especially since you have to close with your opponent if you want to reach the vitals, heart, lungs, whatever. From a distance, you can cut, the radial nerves, the radial artery in the hand, or the tendons across the back of the hand, before your opponent can get within reach of you, if he's armed with knife, stick, bare hands, whatever. Plus, because these are surface and smaller areas, you can work with a smaller knife. You don't have to have a large knife to affect that. Now, a large knife helps. I got one of these. I can literally chop off a limb. My application doesn't have to be as precise, and the damage is going to be immediate. I mean, once that hand is gone, you can't use it. Whereas if I cut the tendons across the back of the hand, it can actually still close, and they may still remain functional for a fairly long period of time, doing damage to me the whole time. Likewise, cutting the nerves, if I don't cut them all the way, it still may be partially functional. So, this is part of it here. But basically, we're looking psychology, which mainly because it's the first thing. If the guy doesn't want to mess with us, we're good. Central nervous system, which can be difficult with a knife. Exsanguination, which is less difficult but takes time. Cutting off the air. Damage to the limbs. Damage to the limbs is immediate. It's easy. It's probably the best approach for a knife, especially since your first available target is likely to be a limb. Now, anatomy is very important. You have to understand what it is you're trying to do. If you don't know where the radial artery is, you can't cut it. If you don't know where the brachial artery, the subclavian artery, if you don't know where the heart is, if you don't know where the bones are between you and the heart that you're going to try and penetrate. So an understanding of anatomy is terribly important. This also tells you which muscles control what portions of the body. This tells you which tendons attach those muscles to the bones, which ligaments hold the joints together, and all these are targets. But if you don't know where they are, if you don't know what they do, it doesn't do any good. I strongly recommend one of the anatomy coloring books, and there are a number of them out there. And it sounds odd, coloring book, but really they're very helpful. They're used by medical students. And we're primarily interested in gross anatomy. Again, the muscular system, the skeletal system, circulatory system, just major portions of it. Some of the internals, the kidneys, liver, heart, lungs, that sort of thing. So this will give us a good idea of where they are in the body and how to reach them, what the relationship is. And that also provides us, as the targets present themselves, we can understand what it is we're looking at. Cutting the tricep versus cutting the bicep, understanding where the muscles are and what they do, and it gives you an idea of how to target these areas. So like I said, hit up Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, whatever, and get one of the anatomy coloring books. They're really helpful. Okay, now our targets. They're determined by a number of factors. What are we in a position to reach? I want to disarm the guy. He's got his knife in his hand. Okay, if he's got his hand back here, I can't reach it. I'm going to have to get clear past him to reach it. So that's not a viable target. However, if he's got it's out extended towards me, he's waving at my face or whatever, well, now we've got a viable target because it's within reach. Likewise, if I'm trying to stay out of arms or foot, if he's kicking, foot reach of this guy, I can't very well target the carotids, the heart, because in order to close with that, I've got to get past whatever it is he's got extended, which is, bridging the gap. You can do it, but you may not want to at that point. It may suffice to simply take a couple of shots at his leg while he's got it extended. Cut that calf muscle, cut the Achilles tendon, watch him fall on his face, and then leave. Whatever. Okay. The other thing is, how will our knife affect it? Stab to the heart is interesting, provided you have sufficient blade length to do it. A 6-inch blade, again, if the guy's not overweight, carrying a lot of heavy clothes or whatever, will probably reach the heart coming up from underneath. If you've got a 4-inch or shorter blade, you may have a very difficult time doing that. So what you have to do then is modify what your target's. That target is basically not going to be available to you. So now we're back to cutting limbs, carotid artery, above the eyes to put, that sort of thing. So your blade, also your blade style. This is a heck of a chopper. The point is well out of line with the hilt. If I try and stab with it, it's not terribly effective. So this, anything requiring a stab, this is not going to be your best choice. Requiring a chop, absolutely. Now this is also because of the inward curve. Slices are a little difficult. Now they'll work, but it's not quite the same as something that's a little more in line. Chopping, this thing, beautiful. That's what it's good for. So any target that makes itself available that would be affected by a chop, especially with such a heavy weapon, that would be great. Something like this. Now this blade has a lot of belly to it, so it's excellent for slicing. Chopping, because of its lack of length, lack of weight, a target that I'm going to want to chop on, bone for example, or trying to chop through tendons or whatever, that's my. So we'll maybe switch to slicing. And again, because of length, a lot of the internals aren't going to be available to us. So you have to look at what your knife's going to do. Likewise, if I don't have, now this has got a very nice edge on it. It's got a lot of belly to it. Slicing muscles is going to be quite easy with it. Slicing tendons, arteries, I don't need quite that much, but this gives a lot of slicing power. If I've got something with a little straighter edge, yes, it slices well, but it probably won't slice to the depth that the more curved edge will. So you have to understand what effects the design, the style of your blade are going to have on your intended targets. Likewise, this one, the point is fairly well in the line. It'll work for stabs, but what am I going to stab? So now the other thing is, how difficult is it to damage? And that's partly based on your technique. Tendons are much more difficult to cut than muscle. Arteries can be surprisingly difficult to cut, especially if you're trying to work lengthwise. Your lungs, very easy to penetrate. However, it takes a while before those take any effect. Kidneys, liver, what have you. Now, bone is extremely difficult to damage. And as a matter of fact, you have to be very careful with bone because, going for a lung, you may want to go in sideways to get through the ribs, or be aware that you may stick in the ribs. So you modify your technique to your blade and how difficult your target is to cut. Now, types of target. You've got all kinds of materials, all kinds of tissues in the body. And starting from the outside, you've got clothing. And that can go anywhere from Kevlar to hard body armor, heavy leather, just heavy winter clothing. Silk. Silk is surprisingly difficult to cut. And if it's got any padding underneath it, if it's any thickness, it's very similar to Kevlar. Now, Kevlar soft body armor, you get a double-edged stiletto with a fairly sharp point or an ice pick. It will penetrate Kevlar armor in a stab, won't in a slash. So again, there you may have to modify your technique. Guys got Kevlar gloves on, something like that. So if we've got exposed targets, neck, wrists, whatever, if it's not exposed, you're going to have to go through the clothing. And not just clothing. If you've got a large dog, for example, with a heavy coat, you've got to get through all that fur before you can do any real damage, or limit your targets to what is not covered by quite so much fur. You've got the various tissues. And again, lung is just as soft and easy to penetrate as can be. Muscle is much more difficult. Again, get yourself a uncooked steak, cut on it, that's muscle. Now, muscle also changes if it's flexed. Jim Bowie in the Vidalia sandbar, he was run through with a sword. He tensed his muscles. The sword wielder couldn't pull it out and got himself killed. So you have to be aware that muscle, relaxed, muscle cuts differently than tensed muscle. Arteries, again, arteries can be kind of slippery. They can be a little tough to cut. It's a good idea, maybe, like I said, a blade with some belly to it. This is where the edge of your blade, the rolled appleseed, Moran, convex edge, whatever you want to call it, is a superb on field knives. It holds an excellent edge. It's durable. I like it a lot. Perhaps on a fighting knife, you might want more of a hollow grind. It's not a durable edge, no. And if you're going to be chopping a lot of wood, then you probably don't want it on there. But if you've got a real self-defense fighting knife that you're not using for everyday tasks, that has a lot to recommend it, because it will cut tissue. It will cut things like arteries much more easily than more of a wedge grind, whatever. But it's a good idea to keep your knife sharp as well. Tendons, ligaments, your connective tissue, very difficult to cut. However, they're very effective. If you can cut a tendon, that whole muscle group becomes useless. Again, you cut an Achilles tendon, they're not going to stand on that foot. If you can cut the tendons in the wrist, that hand won't work. If you cut tendons on the bicep, that arm won't work. But tendons are very difficult to cut. And again, get yourself a piece of steak. You get a big old piece of gristle in there. You get the chicken nuggets, the cartilage or whatever, and try cutting it. I mean, that's part of why primitive man used it for so many purposes, because it was so tough. So if you're going to cut tendons, you have to use a technique and have a blade design that allows that. Ligaments, bone is very difficult. I see a lot of guys demonstrating techniques without taking account the bone that they're going to either have to cut through or they're going to run into. You stab down behind the collarbone into the subclavian artery. Excellent technique. Long enough blade goes right down into the lung. However, you've got the collarbone. Now the collarbone is very easily broken. It's not very easily cut. These guys, they're going there, stab, and they're going to go all the way down. Sorry, no. As soon as you hit that bone, guess what? You're pretty well going to stop. You may even lose grip on the knife if the guy pulls away from you. Likewise, in a stab, you stab a knife with a fairly narrow point. You stab into bone, it may stick. It may stick worse than if you stuck it into a piece of wood, at which point you may have a problem. Even bayonets had problems with that, between the bone and the muscle. And bayonet, you're taught to fire around to get everything clear of that bayonet so you can withdraw it. Of course, bayonets aren't used much anymore. But if it's going to happen with a bayonet, imagine what it's like with a knife, where you don't have the leverage of an entire rifle attached to it. So you get that tip stuck in bone. You have to be ready to hang on to that blade. You also have to be ready if your opponent moves sideways on you. He may very well take the end of your blade off. So it's when you're stabbing, be aware of the bone, be aware of where it's going to go. Now, you get something with a little duller point, it's not as likely to stick in bone. It's also not as likely to penetrate Kevlar. So, it's a balancing act. Okay, now, test cutting is an excellent idea. Gives you an idea of what your knife will do, gives you an idea of what your technique will do, and if you can get correct materials, it lets you know exactly what it takes to cut through a material. If you butcher your own animals, field dressing game, this gives you a terrific opportunity. Now, I've seen guys completely disjoint large animals with little disposable bladed scalpels, because they were able to apply it exactly as they needed to in exactly the place they needed to. It's not the same as a larger blade. When you've got a non-moving game animal, it's been put down, you have all the time in the world to apply the blade exactly where you need to. If you've got a moving opponent who's trying to do you damage, you don't have that time. You don't necessarily even have the precision. I'm aiming to cut his radial artery, and he moves his hand forward an inch. All of a sudden, I'm not hitting the same part. He turns it. All of a sudden, I'm hitting bone. So this is something you have to be aware of. Now, the other thing about test cutting, which I'm totally in favor for, is I watch guys, their technique changes. They're sparring, they're shadow boxing, whatever, and they're making these little conservative slashes. They're keeping their hands well in the center line, which is what you should do. You don't want to get too far out unless you're trying to draw your opponent out or whatever. But they're making these nice little. Then they get a side of beef. They're going to demonstrate what their knife can do. They make these great broad power strokes. Okay. Now, is that what you're going to do in a fight? You need to make up your mind. Are you going to do this great broad power stroke, opening yourself up here? Too much time. The guy can block it. I mean, there's any number of things that can happen with these great broad strokes. So let's keep our technique when we're doing our test cutting the same as we intend to use in the fight. If you're making little short, fine, then see what your knife will do with that. Modify your body mechanics, modify your technique so you can maximize your damage when you're using the technique as you feel you're going to in a fight. If you think you're going to do these great broad power strokes, well past, shooting past the target and opening yourself up, okay, so be it. And maybe you get the one-shot kill in. It's not likely, but it's possible. So make sure when you're doing your test cutting, you're cutting with the techniques that you intend to use in a potential fight. But yeah, you need to look at, again, your blades. your techniques, your relationships between you, the blade, your target, and your opponent. And that's all going to be constantly changing. This is something you can't necessarily plan on. You have to be ready to adapt to the situation, and you have to be ready, improvise, adapt, overcome, do what you need to do. Don't get locked in, especially mentally. Stay aware of the changing situation. Be ready to change, but have a good idea of what your knife is capable of and what you're capable of with your knife against the different targets.